Miller of the AP joins me. You can follow Zeke on Twitter at Zeke J. Miller. Hello, Zeke. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Walk us through what happened yesterday and what you think it means.
Well, late yesterday, the president announced that Brad Parscale, his campaign manager, his longest-serving campaign manager, I should say, would be out of the job and demoted to senior advisor. Bill Stepien, sort of a more traditional veteran Republican political operative who had served as a senior advisor before that, a senior political advisor to the president, and was his field director back in 2016, would be taking over the post immediately. It's a significant shakeup. But talking to campaign sources over the last 12 or so hours, it does sort of codify the structures that have already been in place in an effort by the president and the president's team to bring in more veteran, traditional political advisors and political advice into a campaign that had previously been sort of run by the seat of the pants, by somebody who is more of a novice to presidential politics.
Now, as I pointed out to Steve Kornacki on MSNBC last night, on July 22nd, 1988, Michael Dukakis was ahead of George W. Bush by 17 points. A 9.5-point deficit, which is the average deficit of the 5 polls released yesterday, doesn't mean much at this point if you get the right message and you jackhammer it home in the key critical states. Does Stepien have it? I know Jason Miller has also returned to craft messaging. Do they have what it takes to focus and execute on a daily basis with the president in the 3 to 6 or 7 states that matter?
They certainly have the experience and the discipline themselves, and I think that is a significant change over the last couple of weeks. A lot of Republicans inside the White House and out have looked for more discipline out of the Trump campaign, and I think we'll probably start to see that. The question is whether or not the president is sort of on board with that as well, because that's sort of he's the one who is sort of the ultimate communications director for his White House, but also his campaign. Does he stay on message? His Monday night Rose Garden address, that press conference where he was sort of trying to draw a very explicit contrast with Joe Biden over and over and over again, while it was sort of panned widely in the media among the president's political advisors. It was that was the speech they've been dying for him to give the last several weeks or months. If the president can stay on that sort of message, that's what you'd be seeing. That you may start to see some of those poll numbers change, but that's the sort of the big question mark is that sort of discipline a sort of thing you can impose it on a campaign, but can you impose it on a president?
He did it again yesterday in Atlanta talking to the UPS workers. But I agree with you, and I said to Steve Kornacki, who's coming up later in the hour last night, message discipline, the Venezuela option, which is 20 years ago, Venezuela was rich. Now they're the most impoverished country in South America. It can happen here. That's the short version of it. It's a powerful message. It just has to be repeated. Now, I've noticed Trump can sell anything, right? That's what he's done his entire life. He's a developer. And that's a fun message to sell. He can also sell Joe Biden isn't the guy. He's run by Bernie and by AOC. And it doesn't get old. But he usually gets a feedback loop from Rallies, Zeke Miller, and you can't have the Rallies right now. How much is that handicapping him?
I think it's hard to overstate how challenging that is for the president. Personally, we've seen him, how those rallies have animated him, sort of reinvigorated him on the campaign trail. They were sort of the lifeblood of that 2016 effort, and the extended stretch in which he has not been able to hold campaign rallies through the duration of this crisis has really taken a toll. He tried to recreate a little bit of that atmosphere in the Rose Garden, and it's a very different thing when you're doing it in front of a couple dozen journalists outdoors in the heat than in an arena with thousands of screaming fans. And the message doesn't resonate quite the same way without the applause track, so to speak, of the people around there. And potentially the president's sort of own delivery of it suffers as well. I think that's something that the president and his campaign is still struggling with. Is how do they, find some sort of replacement for that? And is that something that they can ever truly fully replace? And do they need to explore other avenues to try to get the president's message out? And I don't think they have a perfect answer for that just yet.
Zeke, I'm reminded, because I'm from Warren, the president used to fly in on the Trump airplane in 2016. He would land at Youngstown Warren Airport, which is in Vienna, and that's how it's pronounced up there. And there would be a few thousand people on the tarmac, and there's plenty of space. And these airplane skips, he'd come out, talk for 45 minutes, and he'd be gone. Is that in the works? Because it's outdoors. Everybody agrees outdoors in space is fine. People should wear masks, but is that in the works?
That's what they were trying to do this past weekend in New Hampshire. It didn't quite work. There were the legitimate weather concerns. There were also the crowd concerns as well. Sort of the muted comments from the governor, but he would not personally attend. It's it is safer, obviously, to do an event outdoors, given what we have all learned so far about this virus. But there still seem to be concerns among, about any sort of large gatherings, and obviously doing something outdoors, you have to then contend with the weather as well. It's not something that you can necessarily lock in two or three events a day, 3 weeks out, as you would normally set up at the end of a campaign schedule. A couple of months out before election day, and know that you can go through that with certainty. It is an open question right now whether the president can return to rallies at all before election day, given some of these virus spikes, and even in some of these states, and the cooperation. These rallies require the cooperation of local government officials as well, state government officials. So it's you sort of the Venn diagram of when the weather is good, where there's a safe venue, where the state and local officials aren't going to use their powers to try to block it. Where that intersection is, that overlap, is often pretty small.
Now, Zeke, the other part of this is one-on-one interviews. I have long been a proponent that his best media setting is one-on-one, extended, and I recall him sitting down with Anderson Cooper, him sitting down with anybody in 2016 with me, and just he can craft his message into any one-on-one interview. And I have noticed, I've been interested to see he is moving that. Catherine Herridge, Katie Pavlik, doing Chris Wallace this weekend. Is that the de facto going forward move? A couple of those a day?
Talking to White House officials, it does seem that they're moving in that direction. Their challenges, while often those are positive, sometimes there's that one bit of one of those interviews that is negative. You do enough of those interviews, any politician is going to make a mistake at some point and say something they probably shouldn't have, and they're concerned sometimes those get amplified more than the positive messaging they're trying to drive. But it does seem that they're trying to put the president out there a whole lot more, because that is just he's used to saturating the airwaves, and when he was holding these rallies, they'd be wall to wall on cable news. They'd take over Twitter. They'd be driving the conversation, and increasingly as Joe Biden is trying to start driving his own message, as just sort of the world is sort of in its current state all around us, with concerns about the coronavirus, the economy, and the like. The president has found that his microphone doesn't have the same amount. The volume's turned down a little bit, so he's trying to find new ways to sort of speak louder and reach the American people.
Do you see the Jacksonville outdoor nomination speech as inevitable, an outdoor acceptance speech?
I think nothing is inevitable. I think there's still a big question mark whether something quite like that goes forward, even given the state of the situation. I think an indoor event there seems very unlikely, given the troubling numbers out of Florida, given the concerns from local officials. It certainly would not feel like the event the president's been trying to have all the way through. He can try for something outdoors, but again, the weather in late August in Jacksonville, that's hurricane season too. Even aside that, just the heat and the humidity, filling that sort of crowd, the safety of that. There are so many question marks around it. I think at this point, to say anything around the convention as a certainty would be foolish.
So, Zeke Miller, to wrap up, the president's down in the average of the 5 polls released yesterday, 9.5 points. There are some outliers in there. The Sunday Express poll has him tied. But I think inside the White House, they think they're down 8 to 10. It's not even panic time, because Dukakis was ahead of Bush by 17 points at this point in 1988. What does Stepien have that Parscale doesn't?
He has a lot more years in traditional politics. Brad Parscale was the web developer for the Trump golf courses back in 2014, 2015, before he got sort of looped into the campaign by Jared Kushner. And Bill Stepien, worked for Chris Christie. He was a field director on the past Trump campaign. He sort of knows the nuts and bolts of how Republican campaigns are run. And he's got, he knows how to build coalitions, how to drive message, things like that, things that are effective. He knows how to bring some discipline on an organization. So I think we can start to look for those. He doesn't necessarily have the same relationship with the president or with Jared Kushner, for that matter. So how he interfaces with the White House will really be something to watch in the next
But
couple of
Jason
days and
Miller
weeks.
does he not? Jason Miller is a confidant of the president.
No, absolutely. So I think how the pair of them work together and try to coordinate message across will really be the test of how well this relationship works out.
Zeke Miller, always a pleasure to talk to you. Follow him on Twitter at Zeke J. Miller, the AP's fine White House reporter. Always got to be listening to him. And what's the message?